Welcome back to the channel. This is Tartarian Explorer here. I have a really great presentation of lost and demolished buildings in New York City that I can't wait to share with you. But before I do that, I got the question from a friend out of the blue. Can you explain what Tartaria is? And I was like, oh my gosh, I've done that so many times, but people still want to know, what is Tartaria? What does it mean? I stayed up that night thinking about it, and I wrote this response. Tartaria is a keyword I use for my social media profiles because it is a popular search term for people who are looking into alternative history. In the past, the builders of glorious architecture that we cannot, or for some reason do not replicate today, built the Earth's infrastructure. This includes all canals, waterways, starforts. Many cities were shaped like this. City walls, churches, healing centers, incredible fountains, music theaters, power plants, parks, gardens, public meeting places, and crystal palaces. Everything was made with a level of detail that is mind-bogglingly perplexing compared to our current civilization. How did they build it all? What tools did they use? Free energy was surely a technology of the past. Air travel by zeppelin was common. They docked on the top of buildings in the city centers like the Empire State Building. They are called mooring towers. Electric trains were popular. That is until we switched to gas-powered vehicles that require us to constantly refuel. And then there's the whole spiel on the World Fairs, but I can't get into that now. The question arises, why were so many cities destroyed by fire? Was there a massive worldwide flood in the past? And how old is the Earth really? I would argue that there was and still is a war on old world architecture, especially the kind that may have been used for energy technology for the previous civilization. Unless you search for the truth, you'll be left with lies in public schools. Unfortunately, this is the world we live in, where deception is the default. There is an agenda to keep us dumbed down. I think if we start to question history, we can also start to see how powerful we really are. Without further ado, A Lost New York. Here we have the great Pennsylvania Station. A reading from Lost New York from the 1960s. According to contemporary accounts, the Great Quarry made by the excavation was comparable to the building of the Panama Canal. The design was also a conscious enough attempt on the part of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company to establish the importance of railroads by building a preeminent building, a civic masterpiece. What the newspapers called an undertaking without precedent was therefore fairly considered to have exceeded the greatest public efforts of history. When it was completed in 1910, New York had a station built with the grandeur of Rome. In fact, it was supposed to be a replica of the Caracalla Baths. But behind the ingenious magniloquence of its facades was the genuine mastery of its steel-ribbed spaces. The great train course was covered with acres of glass in domes, arches, and vaults. A free translation of masonry formed into the fragile elements of machine technology, and not so much in the academic tradition of historicism as in the new tradition of the crystal palaces and the glass galleries and halls of Paris exhibitions. This was the space the spectator saw as he arrived in New York. The corrugated glass roof, arches, and domes, and the main concourse and open level above the tracks. Sadly, this masterpiece
was demolished in 1963. Until the first blow fell, the New York Times wrote on October 30th, 1963, no one was convinced that Penn Station really would be demolished, or that New York would permit this monumental act of vandalism. Any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and ultimately deserves. Even when we had Penn Station, we couldn't afford to keep it clean. We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. The station was sacrificed through application of the real estate logic that often dictates the demolition of the very building that it makes an area desirable. In a letter to the Times, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company asked, "Does it make any sense to preserve a building merely as a monument?" This is the beautiful Central Park. Its design is attributed to Frederick Law Olmsted, who is also attributed to many other parks such as Emerald Necklace in Boston, Jackson Park in Chicago, Biltmore Estate in Asheville, and U.S. Capitol Grounds, as well as Mont Royal in Montreal. It's twice as large as Regent's Park or Hyde Park in London, and only Dublin, Vienna, and Paris have bigger ones. The construction of the park cost, adjusted for inflation, $600 million today, a vast sum at the time, even for so vast an undertaking. The backdrop of the buildings also makes the enormous 2.5 by half mile size of the park visually clear and understandable in terms of human scale. I'm reading from Lost New York. 150,000 people can be within it on a pleasant summer day, but the park is artistically a miniature for all of that, a tiny image of nature. Its original layout has been seriously compromised quite recently, but Central Park remains the greatest example anywhere of an English landscape design, a major art, and the most essential of the fundamental elements of the city. One of the finest pieces of architecture in Central Park, located at the end of the mall, on the opposite end of Bethesda Terrace, was Marble Arch. It was unique for many reasons. First, most of the other architecture in the park is built of stone or brick. Built entirely from marble, the arch distinguished itself from other neighbors and was the only bridge built of the material in the entire park. The Marble Arch featured a drinking fountain, a semicircular pergola, and marble benches. A description from 1869 deemed it one of the pleasantest and most elegantly built of all these cool places for rest and refreshment. Indeed, 2 marble staircases led down into a refuge beneath the archway, and also kept pedestrians safe from carriage traffic. Like many things lost in New York City, we have Robert Moses and his quest for automobiles domination to blame. In 1938, the Central Park drives were realigned to accommodate car traffic. The arch was demolished, smashed into pieces, and buried. So sad. Spur Rock Arch, also known as Oval Arch, was demolished in 1934. It's incredible beauty. This was the design sketch for Outset Arch, also demolished in 1934. All I could find on the internet was designs, but I'm sure this was beautiful as well. This is the Tigers and Cubs, a striking bronze sculpture, one of the oldest in Central Park, sculpted by Auguste Nicholas Kane. It depicts a tigress and her young who are in the process of devouring a peacock. Cast in Paris, was presented in 1867 to the Board of Commissioners of Central Park by 12 New York citizens. It was placed in a wooded area in a rock outcropping near the lake. In 1934, it was replaced to the Central Park Zoo, and after the 1988 renovation of the zoo, it took its current position in a protected setting between the Intelligence Garden and the Tropical Zone. I liked it when it had its beautiful, big, huge granite base, which no longer is there. This is the Lost Central Park Music Pavilion, which stood from 1863 to 1921. Quintessentially mold, the Musician's Pagoda, as it was originally called, was like an exotic souvenir of a trip to the East. Brilliantly polychromed, its pencil-thin, cast-iron columns upheld a Moorish-influenced roof and golden dome crowned by a filigree finial. Clarence Cook, in his description of the New York Central Park, gave the sometimes overlooked architecture unabashed praise. The music stand itself is decorated with colors and gilding after design by Mr. Jacob Ray Mould, a gentleman to whom the public is indebted for almost all of the decorative work in the park. It was demolished and replaced by the now standing Naumburg bandshell. Once referred to as Central Park's sore thumb, it is treasured by millions of New Yorkers. This is City Hall subway station, located underneath City Hall Park in Manhattan. Reading from a blog, the abandoned 1904 City Hall subway station. The new mayor, George B. McClellan, was explicit. He wanted it to be a showplace. My station under City Hall, he insisted, would be more beautiful than the rest. Calling on Raphael Gustavino, Hines and Lafarge incorporated his graceful soaring tiled arches, creating a vast, elegant station. 12 brass chandeliers illuminated the earthly ochre, green and black arts and crafts tiles. 9 stunningly ornate leaded glass skylights pierced the ceiling of every fourth bay. On the opposite wall from the platform, large bronze plaques honored the architects, the engineers, and the politicians responsible. During World War II, the beautiful skylights were blacked out for security purposes, eventually becoming covered over. Then, because the nearby Brooklyn Bridge stop was more convenient, fewer and fewer passengers were using the elegant station. In 1945, the Transit Authority shut down the City Hall station, demolishing the ornamental kiosks and sealing the entrances under concrete slabs. The tiled arches and brass chandeliers were thrust into tomb-like darkness, and the station was essentially forgotten. Today, there are a limited amount of tours per year, and you have to be a New York Transit Museum member to join, and it costs $50 per person. They sell out very quickly when they're... Just about the only parts of the subway system that appear to have been created by a human being. The iron and glass subway entrances that protected descending passengers from wind and emerging ones from rain were all removed and demolished by 1967. Here we have the Broadway Tabernacle, which stood at 340 to 344 Broadway between Worth and Catherine Lane. It was built by a church society in 1836 to promote the growth of New England Congregationalism in New York, but its most memorable function was its service for a while as the city's main meeting hall. Many anti-slave rallies were held at the Tabernacle, and numerous old prints show how frequently the hall was the scene of important public events. Sadly, the Tabernacle was sold and demolished in 1857 to make way for a dry goods warehouse. Do you see the beautiful columns the incredibly ornate ceiling and the pipe organ. This is incredible. I just don't see why you would want to get rid of this stuff. It's incredible for people. The healing that went on here probably was insane. 9 blocks uptown from the Tabernacle was Niblos Garden and Theatre at Broadway and Prince Street. It was built in 1827 and was first known as the Sans Souci. For a while, the garden was the major New York exhibition hall hired out for various displays and fairs. The garden and theater was twice rebuilt after fires in 1846 and 1872. Theater fires caused fearful losses in New York. King's 1893 Handbook of New York City records 37 theaters burned during the preceding century. Stringent building laws aimed at providing for fire protection in places of public assembly were finally passed in 1887. Here we have the German Winter Garden, which once stood at 45 Bowery. It was built around 1855, and the dome was one of the earliest made with cast iron rib framing. In 1864, the structure was replaced by the 3,500-seat New Strand Theatre, which became the Windsor Theatre in 1978. And in 1910, the Windsor was torn down to make way for the Manhattan Bridge Plaza. Another celebrated German beer hall was Atlantic Garden at 50 Bowery between Bayard and Canal Streets, across the street from the German Winter Garden and just north of the Thalia Theatre. It stood as its original until about 1922, when it was renovated and altered and changed throughout the coming decades. This is Madison Square Garden II. It opened in 1889. Final cost exceeded the then fantastic sum of $3 million, but the price didn't bother the new ownership group, which included the likes of J.P. Morgan, W.W. Astor, and Andrew Carnegie. For their money, they got a modern Beaux Arts gem with a strong Moorish influence. The garden's bell tower was modeled after the Giralda, the bell tower at the cathedral in Seville, Spain, that had been converted from the minaret of a mosque originally built on the cathedral site. In addition to putting the exclamation point in the building's character, the tower was also New York's second tallest building at 32 stories. The main hall was the largest in the world at 350 feet by 200 feet, and the structure has several theaters, concert halls, and main restaurant, the largest in New York with seating for 1,500, meant it was one of the world's premier event spaces. Standing proudly atop Garden No. 2 was a statue of the goddess Diana sculpted by Augustin St. Gaudens, who also created Central Park's sculpture of William Sherman, and the double-edged eagle US $20 gold coin, still considered one of the most beautiful coins ever minted. Diana was popular. People even started referring to Madison Square Park as Diana's Little Park. The fact that she was meant to spin with her wind didn't help in terms of strength, and after her cloth cape was ripped off in a particularly strong breeze, the statue was removed and installed atop a building in Chicago. Sadly, in 1925, Madison Square Garden II was demolished, primarily because it was not financially successful, and the New York Life Insurance Company, which held the mortgage of the building, decided to tear it down to construct their new headquarters building on the site, now known as the New York Life Building. This is the Broadway Tabernacle, supposedly taking 3 years to build, and was erected in 1902. It stood at Broadway and 56th Street in Midtown Manhattan, costing around $15.5 million in today's currency. It was an advanced and elaborate Gothic cathedral. According to the New York Times, it was the city's most novel edifice. The New York Tribune described it as a beautiful cathedral-like structure, which embraces within its walls a huge auditorium, 2 chapels, a score of Sunday school rooms, parlors, offices, living rooms, a museum, and a safe deposit vault, each function expressed amid the exterior architecture and all accumulating in the tower in a harmonious whole. In February 1969, It was said the congregation had deferred maintenance for 30 years, and $500,000 was due to put it back into good condition. Later that year, it was demolished for a 105-car parking lot. 8 years later, the 34-story Rose Tower was put up and still stands today. I hope you're enjoying the video. From here on out, I'll roll through some of the most beautiful demolished buildings in New York City, and I'll comment on the most interesting ones. I'll put the given build date and the demolished or altered date in the subtitles below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my content, as this helps grow my channel and reach a wider audience. Enjoy. Here we have the Waldorf Astoria. It originated as two hotels built side by side by feuding relatives on Fifth Avenue. Built in 1893 and expanded in 1897, the hotels were raised in 1929 to make way for the construction of the Empire State Building. Their successor, the current Waldorf Astoria in New York, was built on Park Avenue in 1931. And that's also a pretty impressive structure. The Waldorf Astoria was $4.5 million, which is $126 million in 2017 dollars. So its two separate parts were connected by corridors and a hyphen, the Waldorf-Astoria, with its long and very fashionable social promenade known as Peacock Alley. It was faced with marble and lined with palm trees. Peacock Alley was open to anyone who looked rich and powerful and wanted to display appropriate plumage. It was built partly on the site of the most exclusive and coveted society showplace in New York, Caroline Sherman Horn Astor Ballroom, which could only ever hold about 400 guests. So the story of the Pabst Hotel is quite interesting. It stood at the north side of 42nd Street in Manhattan, between 7th Avenue and Broadway in Longacre Square, from 1899 to 1902. It was demolished to make room for the new headquarters of the New York Times, which Longacre Square was renamed Times Square. What's interesting is, standing for less than 4 years, the price, adjusted for inflation today, is $8,453,705. So I guess they're just putting up buildings for a couple years, not thinking ahead. Are they that dumb, you know? I don't know. This is the house of the wealthy shipbuilder John Cox Stevens, referred to as Stevens Palace or the Greek Palace. As we're told, it stood for only 10 years and is described as a striking Grecian fantasy. Surrounded by manicured gardens, the house featured a daring semicircular portico lined with Corinthian columns 2 stories high. A glass conservatory extended from the home's south side, and the whole building was surmounted by a great dome. definitely recommend you do some research on the William A. Clark House. Nicknamed Clark's Folly, it costs an equivalent of today's currency $228 million and stood for less than 20 years. If you believe the story that we're told. Incredible. This was the Windsor Arcade, supposedly built in 1901 on 5th Avenue and 46th Street, designed by Charles Berg I. The three-story arcade features 16 30-foot-tall Corinthian columns, a Mansford roof with skylights, and a large two-story portico topped with a statue of winged genius, surrounded by two lions. The building was covered in terracotta ornament that included flowers, olive branches, and faces. The arched portico led to a garden in the center of the courtyard, where carriages could enter and drop guests directly inside, making it easy to access the dozens of shops, galleries, and clubs. Despite the attention to detail and extravagant ornamentation, the building's owner intended for the Windsor to only cover the expenses of the property until something more profitable could be built on the site. In 1911, only 10 years after the opening, the Windsor was demolished and replaced with an office building. Thank you so much for watching, and I want to leave you with two interesting buildings that you can visit today if you visit New York City. First, we have 55 Wall Street. The Merchant Exchange was supposedly completed in 1842 here. This site has gone through numerous renovations throughout the years, but what still stands today is the original banking hall. Since 2006, the banking room has functioned as an event venue called the Caprini Wall Street, while the upper stories have been a condominium development known as the Caprini Club Residences. This is the Gold Memorial Library at Bronx Community College, supposedly completed in 1900. According to a 1921 article in the New York Times, the reading room had been declared by some critics to have no superiors outside of St. Paul's in Rome. Paul Goldenberg described the library in 1984 as a kind of pantheon, surrounded by the long, curving colonnade of one of the most remarkable places in New York. 3 decades later, Christopher Gray of the Times described Gold as full of brilliant flashes of excitement, like lightning bolts in a grand thunderstorm, in contrast with McKim's design for the Low Library. Columbia University architecture professor Andrew Dulcart said in 2005, "The interior is among the most dramatic and most magnificent in America." The center of the dome originally contained a Tiffany glass skylight, which has since been sealed. The skylight measured 23 feet across. The dome and oculus were restored at a cost of $18.3 million, and an exit stair was added for $2 million. Both projects were completed in May 2023.